Man, we are so glad that you guys have joined us today for this webinar, and it is going to be a great one. My name is Greg. I'm part of the team here at SecureGive, and I'm going to introduce you to our guest, Todd, in just a second. I know people are still joining in the room here, so we want to give people a few moments to join in before we fully get started. But our topic for today, we are looking at building a budget that drives mission. We know that this is the fall. This is a time when you're building your budget for 2025. And so we want to make sure you have what you need to maybe think about your budget a little bit differently this year. So as everybody's getting in here, I want to just let you know a few things. First of all, if you have questions throughout this webinar, please use that Q&A panel. You can open it up on the bottom of your screen, click that Q&A to open it up. Drop questions in there. We absolutely want to answer those. We'll answer some of them as we go throughout the webinar, but also we're going to answer them at the end as well. So throughout, put those questions in there, and then at the end too, we'll make sure we also have some dedicated time for some Q&A. And then, feel free to jump in that chat. Let us know where you're coming from. We'd love to be able to hear that. One of the cool things with this webinar today is seeing the people who have registered. I know some of you guys have been working with SecureGive for a long time. There's people registered who know Todd and have been working with him for a while, and people that maybe you're actually just connecting with SecureGive and with Todd for the very first time ever through this webinar. So we are so glad that all of you are here today. So as we get going, let me introduce to you Todd McMichen. Let me tell you a little bit about Todd. So Todd has been working in ministry as a senior leader, as a consultant for over 30 years. He has been helping churches drive fundraising initiatives, growth strategies. He's been helping churches and ministries really conquer a lot of challenges that are unique to churches in regards to stewardship, in regards to fundraising, and just general church finance. He's been helping churches do this across the country, again, for like 30 years. So I'm really excited. I hope you guys are excited to hear from Todd. So welcome, Todd. We are so glad that you're joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me. Looking forward to it. I love talking to church leaders, talking shop. This is going to be fun. Hopefully it's helpful. I would say just a big shout out to all of our friends down in the Louisiana, Texas coast. If you've not lived in hurricane land, I grew up in Florida. It's a nerve-wracking season. And so if you have a pastor friend in that area of town, be praying for them, and be sure to reach out for them and let them know that they're on your mind and heart today.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for touching on that. We're going to go ahead and just get right into some of the meat of this conversation today. Again, we're talking about building a budget that drives mission. In other words, approaching your budget in a way that makes sure the money that's coming into your church is actually going out and doing what your church really wants to accomplish. How do we look at budgeting as more than just keeping the lights on? So to get that started, Todd, I know you've worked with tons and tons of churches in walking them through this process of building budgets and organizing their finances and how they're really teaching stewardship. So as you've been doing that, what are the things you typically see when it comes to budgeting? What approaches do you see churches typically take when they approach building their budget?
Yeah, so I'll talk about 5 different categories of approaches, and they're really broad strokes and buckets, and none of them are necessarily wrong. They all have great points to them. They all have some downsides as well. But it may be helpful to you just to think through as I describe some of these, where you think you're going to land this year. You may have used all of them over time, right? Just depending on what's going on. I'll describe them a little bit for you. And I may be a little extreme in the way I describe them, but I'm not going to be too far. I've seen a lot of things in 30 years. So the first budgeting process I would describe, I'd call it a flat budget. I think we're all very familiar with a flat budget. It's the quickest to plan, right? You just say how much came in last year, how much did we spend? They look to be pretty even. There's no reason to do anything differently. We're going to just push, play, and repeat, and everybody gets the same amount of money. Now, that might be a sign of a lack of growth or a lack of vision. It might be the sign that something catastrophic happened in your community, and being flat is actually a good sign. So I don't want you to hear negativity when it comes to being a flat. That just may be what happens some years, right? So flat planning, easiest, quickest. People have done it based on what's going on. The second one is almost the exact opposite. The exact opposite, I'm going to call a free for all, right? And the free for all is we tell our staff, all right, you have 2 weeks to plan your budget, go dream big. We want to see God change lives in dramatic ways. Tell us what it's going to take, make your plan, and bring it back to us. Well, when you do that, everyone gives you the biggest number. And the really savvy staff members are going to give you even more than what they really need because they know you're not going to give them what they need. And so they're going to end up with a bigger number than they wanted originally, just based on how the process goes. So then you get into the whole yucky business of the budget being requests being way too high. Someone's got to come back and tell them no. It's demoralizing. If it's a smaller church, you might have relatives and friends and family members who are in those ministries. And oftentimes the budget can creep up to 10 to 15% higher because no one wants to make those hard calls. You end up making the hard calls, and then you go back midway through the year and you ask a staff member, how's it going? Why aren't things going great in your ministry? Well, they'll be able to say, well, if you would have given me more money, I'd have been able to do more. And so the free for all, while oftentimes you're trying to increase vision and goals and energy and help people think big, which is a great thing to do, can have some really a long discouraging tail to it. So the flat one and the free for all, somewhere in the middle would be the percentage increase. So you're in a season where, let's just say your fixed expenses, they're going up, big insurance increase. Maybe you added staff in the previous year. And it's just best to go ahead and tell everybody you're going to get a 3% increase in your budget, plan accordingly, and you move on. And it's just your way of kind of managing expectations. And that's all you have. At that point, you really probably aren't driving with vision, and you may not even know what are your most important ministries during that ministry season because everybody's getting the same. The fourth one, which I really like, and hardly anybody does, and it's always shocking when I tell people that I like it, it's the assigned budget. Like the global leaders who know how much money's coming in and know where the church is going, just kind of assign your budget figure. Now, the larger your church is, the more that makes sense. If you work for a large corporation and you were in charge of a department, your presidents and vice presidents would give you a budget number and they would give you some drivers to meet. You wouldn't be dreaming big dreams inside of a company. So it's very normal in the for-profit space, just not as common in the non-for-profit space. But I'm a big fan of it if it's done right. The fifth one is the visionary budget. And you can use a visionary budget plan, which we're going to talk about and unpack in just a little bit. You can use it with any of these, and you should be doing it anyway. But those are 5 big swaths that I see. And they're, any size church can do those, and they have pros and cons, but that's a big bucket swing at it.
So as you're working with churches, helping them through their budget process, what are some, I guess, the common challenges or the common obstacles that you see over and over again that are probably at least some of the things that people joining this webinar today are facing in their ministries?
Right. So if you're joining this webinar, possibly your biggest obstacle is you might be the lone person in the organization that has a global view of all expenses, short and long term, small and big. That's a big obstacle to put the planning of a budget in the hands of people with a very limited view. It creates a lot of stress. And it actually creates wounds and hurt feelings. It creates silos unintentionally. But a big obstacle is when only one person or 2 people have a global knowledge of the whole. That's a problem. The second problem is most congregations do not have long-term vision. Vision can be, equated to a slogan or a tagline, right? Love God, love people, knowing Him, making Him known. Those things have purposes, but a real actionable, measurable vision that drives resources, most churches do not have. And when you don't have that, it's all subjective as to what is the most important thing to spend your dollars on. And the church is typically not creating bad and moral ideas on how to spend their dollars. So it becomes very, very difficult to align resources in the same direction when there is no long-term vision. The third biggest challenge is there's never a safe place to evaluate an expense. Every ministry is not in its heyday. But we keep funding things as if they were in their heyday. And the only way you can get things defunded or less funded if you don't have a long-term vision and a knowledge of the global whole is somebody has to be brave enough to bring up the conversation. And then all of a sudden, now it becomes personal and they don't like my ministry or they have an agenda. And really, you just want to have an honest, evaluative conversation that says, like, we don't have a grove of money trees out back. Are we doing the right thing with all of our resources? No one's doing bad or wrong, and I'm not against you or it. But there's just no safe place to have an honest conversation of evaluating it towards a standard of a vision. Otherwise, it's just my opinion versus yours, and it's just no fun to be a part of those conversations. And pastors in particular, they see it, but then they're forced to kind of bring it up, which makes it really hard on them too.
As you're talking about, those different challenges churches face, I know one common struggle, or one probably maybe universal struggle, is balancing your short term and your long term. Because every church needs to keep the lights on, right? Every church has, probably has, staff they're trying to pay, have taxes, expenses they need to meet. But, the church doesn't exist to pay taxes and to keep the lights on. The church exists to reach people with the good news of the gospel. So how, as you're going through this budget process, what would you say, or how can a church go about balancing the short-term needs that have to be paid for? You got to, pay the power bill, but balancing that with the bigger picture, with the long-term opportunities and the long-term goals and mission of the church.
Well, most times there's no clear pattern for what the long-term needs are. Long-term needs typically have a lot of zeros behind them. Every church is going to have to replace an air conditioning, right? They're going to have to replace a roof. There's a day when your parking lot's going to need to be expanded. There should be a day that our preschool is going to run out of space before our student building does, right? So long-term needs exist for everybody. And sometimes previously, a nonprofit would think we really don't need to have cash reserves because we're a nonprofit. We're not a for-profit business. We should be spending everything we have. Well, that's where the whole capital campaign industry came from, right? Because we just didn't have money in the bank to pay for these really big things. And so not having clearly determined long-term goals really enables short-term goals to get a little bit blown out of perspective. So if I had to kind of back up and say, all right, well, how do you tackle the three obstacles of not having global understanding, of not having long-term vision that's really, really clear, and then not having a safe place to evaluate? Here's some steps that I would lay out, 4 steps, and I would do them in these sequence. I think the first step ought to be every year you ought to have a vision conversation. And that vision conversation should, at least every church should be able to look out and see 3 to 5 years. Now, back in the day, churches would create 10 to 20 page strategic plans, which never moved anywhere, and they took years to build them. So that's not what I'm saying, but every church should be able to name 3 to 5 bullet points of long-term vision. So we're about to be in 2025. So what if we just said, and go out as far as you can, go out to 2022 or 2023, or 2027, 28, even 2030. Go out as far as you can see reasonably and just say, if I could look into the future, this is what I would see. This is what I would dream. It may mean I'd love to see us in 2 services, right? It may mean that, our county has a very high domestic violence rate. What if we set a goal in the next 5 years? We'd like to see that percentage of victims decrease by 10 to 20%. And what could our church do about it? Well, now all of a sudden you've moved vision from knowing him and making him known to something you can all see and plan towards. And now we're not having a conversation around, should we give more money to the student guy or not and his event? It's about how are we going to get there, right? And so most churches don't have that kind of clarity and do not have that kind of unity around vision. So I'll pause right there. Anything you want to say about that? And I'll go on to the other three things.
Yeah, one thing I think along with that, uh, it can be intimidating to think, okay, I've got to have this big plan all figured out. What is the next 3 to 5 years going to look like in our church? But I think to your point, to what you're saying is, you know, first, I guess I'd say start somewhere, right?
Mhm.
Start planning something. First of all, seek the Lord, what He is going to lead your church to do, and He'll speak to you. He'll answer you when you ask. But then beyond that, start somewhere. Start making a plan for something, and as you start doing that, I think you'll start, walking out that process. You'll start getting a clear picture, clear vision of where your church is heading and is supposed to head. And I love the way that you just wrapped that up. That you're taking something broad and somewhat intangible, but you're making it very real and tangible. You're giving people something that they can really grab onto, and they can look and say, "This is the tangible difference that we are going to make through our church." And so we are going to, use our budget as a tool for that.
Yep. So there's a couple of things. Just imagine being able to not only just share what your budget number is, but now what you're saying is our church is setting a goal of decreasing the percentage of the victims of domestic violence. Well, now, the tithing message is not the only thing you're talking about that's related to increasing generosity. We're actually showing you what we're going to do, and we're helping our city get better.
And
Just say as a pause, Greg, to
yeah,
what you mentioned, I can be overwhelming, right? Because I've been doing this for 30 years, and I can just rattle off a bunch of stuff. And so, I would just pause and say to the people who are on this call, you're probably a very detailed person, and part of that being detailed is you don't want to do it until you get it perfectly right, and that will hold you back. And so, I'm going to talk here for maybe 30 minutes and give you lots of little things. Just pick one thing. Pick one thing to do between now and the end of the year, get better at it, take good notes, get the recording when this is over, and just make a list and say, next year, I'm going to start a little earlier and do a little better with that. This is a long-term journey. So don't let me overwhelm you. Just take it as you can.
something that you just said a moment ago, reminded me, saying that that changes the tithe talk. Changes how you're talking about that when you're looking at these, what you're doing in your community. And something that reminded me of is actually something that you said or you wrote in a blog. You said that how we spend the tithe is, just as important, just as holy as giving the tithe. And so, as thinking through the budget and like, what is your church doing? Where are you going? It's also that acknowledgement that the way you spend and allocate these resources is incredibly important, because you are allocating money that God has directed people to give into your ministry. So that tithe is holy when it's given, and that tithe is just as holy when it's spent.
Right. And so that needs to be filtered over how we spend the money. So you think back some mantras that you may hear, right? We're going to challenge our people to be bold. Our budget increased by 5% last year. We're going to expect it to do the same. So we're going to increase our budget by 5%. We've seen the pattern, it works. And we're going to challenge our people to be better givers. Well, I mean, that sounds great. But what if we told our staff, and this always gets the rolling of the eyes when I say this, but what if we just said, hey, do you think we're a good enough staff that we could spend less and produce more results for the kingdom? Like, are we good enough to do that? What if we tried that once? What if we just really went all in to see? I'm telling you, I don't consult a church that doesn't have money that could be reallocated to a better ministry option. But we just don't have those conversations. But then when you put it in the light of that, the tithe, the Bible says, is holy, right? Is holy. Everything is holy when we spend it too. So we've got a high calling on top of these dollars that we're entrusted to. So don't take your budget lightly at all. So you want me to move on to the second one?
Let's keep going. Yeah.
All right. So vision is important. Vision is important. And if I had to lay this out in how you would do this in the ideal calendar sense, because some people are going to look at these four things and say, no way I can get it done. I'm in the middle of forming my budget right now. In the ideal sense, I would have loved to have had a pre-existing long-term vision, and around May, before all the staff gets away and people get away for the summer, I would have wanted to pull my staff away for a couple of hours and say, hey, let's dream about next year so we can all come back from summer kind of being on the same page. The next thing I would do is when you leave from a vision, long-term vision clarification is, all right, now we got a baby step. So let's just say we had 3 to 5 bullet points I said over the next 3 to 5 years. You should be able to fit that easily on half a page of paper. All right. Which one do we need to do first? Like, you can't do all 5, and you can't do everything every Sunday, every month of the year. That's another pressure we feel. What of those 5 do you need to do first? And you pick one for the next year. Pick the one that sometimes it forces you. It forces you to pick the first thing because there's a sequence to it. Other times I would say, honestly, pick the easiest one that you can win at the fastest. Let's just get a win under our belt and get some confidence. Let me give you an example of an internal goal you could have. Let's pretend you did some research and you found out that 80% of your dollars were coming from 10% of your people. Okay. You didn't know that. Budget giving was great. Expenses were great. Everything was good. But someone came to the pastor and said, hey, I know it feels great, but we're highly leveraged by just 2 families. And if something happens, we're going to be in trouble. It's important to know that kind of stuff. So what if you then, for the next year, you said, okay, we are going to seek to increase the percent of first-time givers by 20% the next year, right? So most folks would never focus in on first-time givers. Every large donor at one point in time in your ministry was a first-time donor. And the number one driver of generosity is someone's level of engagement in living out the vision. And so now if we said, all right, we're going to increase first-time givers, that means we're reaching more people. That means we've clarified our guest services. That means we've clarified the path to generosity. It means we're talking about the church in a cause-oriented way, not just paying down our debt or giving to our budget or the building campaign. It means we're appropriately thanking people and celebrating. There's so much great that comes when you name one goal. Right. And you could have 2 to 3 goals in a year. We get really nervous about goals because we say, well, we're eliminating other stuff. Well, you're not eliminating other stuff. You're just focusing your resources as a team towards that one goal. So first thing is vision, long term, 3 to 5 years. Then you pick a 1-year goal or 2 to 3 goals that will help you get there. And that would be the next step. And I would want that typically done in that July, August timeframe. So I'll pause there and see if you have any thoughts or you want me to unpack that further or move on.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about how, there's obviously so much practical application to, first-time givers or encouraging new givers, that kind of stuff. But also reminds me that through this whole process of casting vision and building your budget, there's so much more than just like this mechanism of allocating funds. Because as you're, encouraging people to begin giving for the first time and teaching people that, you're discipling people. Like, this is all discipleship at the root of it, engaging people and getting people on board, whether it's your staff or people in your congregation on what your church is doing and that being expressed through the budget. This is all part of discipleship. When it all comes down to it.
Yeah. So just imagine it's a lot more fun to talk about the spiritual gift of generosity or the spiritual discipline of generosity that everybody needs. I often hear pastors say, well, we just get everybody to tithe. Well, you probably got 20% of your people, 10% of your people tithing, and that's all they've been doing for 40 years. That's not what the Lord asks us to do, right? We serve a generous God. We're created in His image. There's a lot to be taught about. Even beginning this call, I want to encourage people to live generously by thinking of a person or a family or a church or somebody down along the Louisiana coast. I mean, we have to think and live generously as leaders, and it has to ooze out of us, not just when it's time for that tithing message. And most pastors don't realize that in their digital giving system, there's an automated, populated thank you that can go to everyone who makes a gift that can be customized. Right. So every month, if hey, this is a mission trip month, right? Our vacation Bible school month, when someone makes a donation digitally or even in your monthly thank you letters, you could be very specific and let them know how they're moving the dial in ministry and changing a life, transforming the city, or making an impact around the world. And that's why people want to give. They want to give to make a difference.
Yeah, we could do another hour on uh, on just talking about that principle of
Right.
communicating with the people that are giving to your church, reminding them of what they're giving towards. And so many times we don't talk about what's happening in our churches to the people who are there. We assume everybody knows what's going on, but a lot of times people don't know all the things that are going on and don't know the magnitude, of ministry, of things that are happening and lives that are being impacted by that. Again, we could do a whole other webinar just on that. But
Well,
such an
I would
important
just say, stay tuned. There'll be a
yeah,
blog in January on where did the offering plate go?
yeah,
Post Corona, I mean, we don't even talk about the offering anymore because Corona wasn't, for most people, wasn't a cash challenge, right? We ended
mm,
up having more cash because our events expenses were lower, and so now most churches hardly even talk about the offering whatsoever, and you're leaving a lot of opportunity on the table there and denying people an opportunity to be involved in what God's doing. So I've given two steps. I've given the step of vision. I've given the step of goals. There's a third step, and we're still not to planning the budget yet. We're still not there. The third step is plan your calendar. Plan your calendar to align with the goals you set. So all of a sudden, we're looking at, do we have some big events that we do every year that if we just tweak them a little bit towards the goal, we still do the event, but now it's not a one off. It has some synergy to it and alignment to it. We can now begin to plan some sermon series around it, some small group curriculum around it. Will we need to do some extra training, recruit some volunteers? we have we have to do our budget last. The last thing is to line up your resources. Let's get the vision, the yearly targets. Let's plan some big rock events to happen in the future year, so we know what we have to fund. Now let's go have the conversation. Now that we all agree to all of this, the last thing you do is you plan your budget allocations. Most churches grab one of those five approaches that I said at the beginning, minus the visionary one. Start there. Maybe they plan a calendar 6 months in advance. Most don't have measurable goals, and many do not have, long-term clear vision other than, a slogan, which is great and important and necessary, but not really enough clarity to drive a hard choice.
So you're almost saying, if when you don't have those things mapped out in advance, you really put yourself in a position to say, I've got my budget. Now, how can I try to get ministry out of these dollars? Versus flipping that around and saying, here's what we're going to do ministry. Now, let's design our budget to make sure that the ministry is funded.
Yeah. So, I mean, just imagine the administrator, executive pastor, and you're the only one that has global perspective. And now you're having to deliver bad news to everybody because you just know it's not going to work, all that they're asking for. Whereas if we flip this conversation and we all are uniting around the direction, now they're bringing energy to the table. Like I've sat in rooms where I've heard associate pastors say this: if I know we're going there, I'm pushing all my money into the center because that's more important than what I normally plan every year. Just tell me what to do. And that's the kind of spirit you want to get to, so we don't feel like it's our money and we own it, but we're here serving the kingdom and the group as a whole, and we're all moving that direction together.
Absolutely. Bob just chatted this into us, who's head of our webinar. It's a great phrase. You may have heard it, but if you fail to plan, then you plan to fail.
Yep.
Right. So if you're not planning, then you're just setting yourself up for failure.
Well, and here on the back end, we always are great with, looking back. So we'll not make the plan, but we can selectively look back and find a few good things that happened well, and we hang our hats on those. And we don't talk about the things that didn't happen well, that if we just paid attention to them, we could have seen something extraordinary happen. And so let's go back to my comment before about an obstacle, about we don't have an honest evaluative process. Well, if you have a vision and a goal that's clear and we all agreed to it, well, now all of a sudden, when we talk about a big expense item, we are now talking about how do we together theme that to get the most out of it, instead of me having to walk into a meeting as the global leader and say, I've got to convince you we're spending way too much money here and it's not reaching the right result. And that person feels like it's you against them. And that's really not what you're trying to do. But there was no place to have a safe conversation where we can all be together on. So, I mean, it helps on the evaluation side without it being personal and agendized.
So you've got you're making your calendar for the year. What do you do? What comes after that? Is it getting into actually building the nuts and bolts of the budget from there?
The last thing is you're assigning the money. And that's why I would say if you've gone this far into it, I would let your financial experts do the lion's share of the work because they're the only ones that know how much it costs to replace all the light bulbs in this building, right? And somewhere along the way, everybody needs to know what are your main ministry drivers, because the main ministry drivers we all should be resourcing. For instance, 20 years ago, you could hire a student pastor and expect your youth ministry to really grow if you had a great student pastor. Well, that doesn't happen today. Student ministries grow typically because you have a dynamic preschool and children's ministry. And the pressure put on student pastors oftentimes to have big Sundays and to drive church growth doesn't happen anymore. And if I was a student pastor, I would be the biggest friend of that children's ministry because they're my feeder, right? And so having this conversation that says these are the most important things we do, and all of us should push the most resources into the center of the table for those things, because if they grow the most, it helps everybody else out. It helps everybody else out. And you can have conversations about volunteerism. All right, we're all competing for the same volunteers. Well, we ought to be able to give our best volunteers to the most important places because we know what helps us all. And so a lot of those conversations then come up during this process, and that's where you get this tremendous amount of teamwork and camaraderie out of the budgeting process. But again, I would say I really do like the most knowledgeable financial people doing the lion's share of the work.
A big piece of this is creating that alignment within your team. And that's your starting point, right? Your church can't be aligned until your team is aligned under that same idea. Do you have any other thoughts, any other advice for a leader who is struggling with people on their team that are, feel like they need to fight for their piece of the budget, or are not seeing the bigger picture, like helping them create that alignment, helping them break down those silos between ministries when people aren't naturally just grasping that vision?
Yeah. So when you don't have a unifying vision that the entire team has rallied around and submits to, the only other option is for everyone to create their own little visions. So now you have competition. And you have competitions of very good ideas. Like I said, the church isn't sitting around thinking up bad ideas. So you have this amazing event. It's decorated well. The food is great. The room was crowded. Everyone has an amazing time. And you walk out and you say, we did it. We did it. Well, how did you move the discipleship needle forward? Did anyone have that conversation before you planned the event? Did you name the goal you wanted to achieve on the back end? And were you moving people down the next step? A good feeling in a well-decorated room with great food is amazing. I enjoy it as much as anybody else does. But if you don't name in advance what you're trying to accomplish to move towards the goal, you'll be justifying everything pretty much. And then once again, it just sets up just awkward conversations that no one wants to have. And so part of that is naming the goal of the event before you actually do it. And just because the event is big doesn't mean it's successful. Like, you put the right people in the room and you have the right conversation, you can really get something done. And so sometimes quality smaller events can actually get more done for discipleship purposes than really large rallying type events. You need them all, of course. But again, if you don't have a vision, you don't have a goal, then the children's pastor or the worship pastor, they can't create mini goals inside of their ministry, right? So that now they're defining the success, and that just becomes not great resources, right? People are not being taken care of well. Your calendar, your room space, and your dollars are all not returning the investment you want them to return.
Yeah, so you're creating this uh, umbrella, if you will. And you have this something like in writing. I think this is maybe a good analogy. In writing, you have the controlling idea for a piece that you're writing, and then every point below that is a support point for that controlling idea. That same kind of thing with vision. You've got the big picture vision for the church, and every ministry, everything that they're doing should be playing its part to build and push towards that vision in their specific way. So once you've got the unity from the team, you've kind of broken through maybe those ministry silos or things that are kind of creating tension, and you've gotten that squared away. How do you go beyond that then and build church engagement? How can a church budget actually be a tool for engagement?
Yep. So if we go back to process, May we did vision, June, July we did goals, August you did calendar, September you're nailing expenses, October you're putting your documentation together, and let's just say you are on a calendar year. And so November, December, you have to make a series of presentations. Maybe your congregational approval, maybe you're not. Even if you're not, you still want people to have buy-in to the vision. Right. So it'd be very common. I'm going to lay out right now, like a few Sundays in November. How do you use the month of November to accomplish a lot to move the vision forward? And there's many, many layers to this. And I know we've only got a few more minutes left, and I'll go as far as we can. But I think the first Sunday in November, I'm always wanting to encourage pastors, have a day of celebration. Like, you need to tell your people what God did in your church through their generosity all year long. We forgot about all the baptisms on the backside of youth camp. We forgot about Easter Sunday. We forgot about, the single mom ministry that we did. So celebrate the difference they are making through their generosity, through their volunteerism. Show them where God's at work. Most lay people do not attach the fruitfulness of the kingdom to them specifically. They look at the person on the stage and say, that person's bearing all kinds of fruit for the kingdom. Well, what am I doing? Well, you're doing a lot by showing up. You're doing a lot by encouraging. You're doing a lot by giving. Help them feel the sense of what God's doing and that we're all a part of something bigger. So that'd be the first Sunday. Second Sunday, I then would cast vision and remind them of long-term vision, where we're headed, and then say, these are the goals for 2025. And you might rename them publicly, whereas in staff meetings, you're probably being very matter of fact. You might name them differently publicly and have more discipleship orientation around them so people know how to step into what you're doing. And you celebrate the movement of the Lord. So maybe you've pointed out how God has been greatly at work because you had the highest attendance VBS in the history of your church. Well, we're going to take that a step further, and we're going to go all in with children's ministries and these activities the first half of the year and transform the next generation like never before. Well, now you're reframing how you're talking about the budget. And it's not line items anymore. It's now, this is what we're going to do together. Okay. So that would be the second Sunday. I would give very specific direction. The third one, I would give them the action steps. Like, how do you lean into this? And you can do a lot with that. Your action steps could be, we're going to spend a week of prayer and fasting about our engagement level in 2025. It could be you wrap it around to end of year giving. And you could say, we want to get 2025 kicked off well. And if we're going to go all in on the next generation, we need to kind of repaint our children's space and we need to upgrade the sound system. It's going to be 50 to 100 grand. The Lord should speak to you between now and the end of the year, or you want to give us a kickstart on that, we love it. Just make an offering between now and the end of the year. It may be volunteerism because you need to double the amount of volunteers in that children's space. So give them an action step that gives them their next easy point of engagement to go with you. They're not cheering you on. They're doing it alongside of you. And then the last week, I would call them to prayer. Like, we want to see God do the extraordinary. That's why we're doing all of this, right? So let's pray for God to do the extraordinary. So that's how I would lay it out. And whether or not your congregational approval or not, I mean, some churches, when they have to talk about budget, they put it on a time and a day and in a room where they hope nobody shows up because they just want to deal with all the questions associated with it. Well, let's make the vision public and what we're doing with all these resources amazing. And let's get a culture going that says we're a part of something that's really significant and really special. And I would even just say, even beyond that, there's so many other things you could do. If you've had a lot of guests coming all year long and they haven't stepped into membership, members are waiting for a very clear vision. And when you show them a clear vision, I often see highest attended new members class right around vision preparation time. I also would say get your key donors together and give them a behind the scenes look on the vision. Because at the end of the year, they're looking to make 5, 6 digit gifts somewhere because their accountant told them they needed to, and they want to give it to you first. And that clear vision is a lot better than saying, hey, we're behind on our budget. Could you just put it over there? Or we want to reduce our debt. Could you just put it over there? So, I mean, there's so many things you can do with a clearly identified vision and aligned budget.
And something as you were talking about, you know, not wanting to avoid having to share it with your church, and pastors and some church leaders feeling that pressure of like, I don't want to have to share this whole budget with my church. Uh, and I just maybe want to encourage you to think, if you're facing that, then it may be a moment to step back and look, is our budget allocating money the right way if I'm not comfortable sharing how our church plans to spend money with the very people who are giving that money to the church? I think that's just something worth asking yourself as you go through this process. If I'm hesitant to tell my church where we're spending the money, then I maybe need to evaluate, are we spending it the best way that we possibly could?
And I would say this, most churches do amazing things with their resources. People don't know you're doing amazing things. And a lot of them might not assume you're doing amazing things. Like if I'm going to be interactive with Habitat for Humanity, I assure you I know what they do. Right? I know what they do. If I'm going to be interactive with a soup kitchen downtown, I know what they do. The fruit of their investment is all around me. Churches, it's not as obvious. It's just not. What they see is buildings and air conditioning and all this kinds of stuff, and they assume. And you do need those things, right? They're important, right? They don't want to sit in unair conditioned buildings, but we don't tell them what we do with our money well enough to really help them latch onto it. And they really just want to know. They just want to know because they want to be involved, and they get rewarded by knowing that.
Yeah, people want to be a part of something. They want to be part of a movement, of a cause that's bigger than themselves. And so sharing with people how the money they give plays into that is absolutely a game changer.
Yep.
I want to throw a couple questions at you, Todd.
Okay.
If now's a good time for that.
Yep.
Some things that people have chatted and asking about. One thing is you laid out, the steps you would take planning the budget, but you did say, in a perfect situation, you're talking about vision and making that clear in May, and then you have this all spaced out. So for a leader who is now in September and they didn't do that part in May, they haven't done the things yet. Can you give any guidance to how would you plan to make use of this season as effectively as possible, to maybe whether it's condensing that process, what would you say, what to do this week or next week, or how would you go about that?
Yeah. So I would practice habits that you want to lean on next year. So I would look at some statistics that I have that I could bring to a meeting of my leaders as we plan the budget. And I would use these same statistics when I did my celebration moment in November. And I would look to show them where we see God at work, where we've seen his activity. And it might not be a statistic, it might be a story. But I would look to where I can see God at work, celebrate what we've done, and say, what if we just leaned a little bit more that direction in 2025? What if we just leaned a little bit more? And so I think starting the thinking process this fall about how we talk about where God's at work, where we start aligning our resources, and you just start that. There's something to do every month of the year when it comes to generosity resource planning and engagement. And so you just start the way of thinking and the way of talking behind the scenes. And you just know I'm starting something and I'm going to get so much better at it every single month. And we're going to get there. Maybe take 2 to 3, 4 years, but I'm going to get there.
Yeah, it's all about starting somewhere and taking steps and not putting it off. Not putting it off, to your point earlier. Not putting it off until you feel like you can do it perfectly.
Yep.
But starting the process now, making progress, not striving for perfection, but striving to make consistent progress.
Yeah, and maybe you just get one line item adjusted. But maybe you take those same stats and stories and now you have some offering talks. I mean, you can go a lot of ways with that the next 3 months.
So you bring up offering talk. Something that someone has asked a question about is how often, in what ways, do you thank your givers? So, whether it be from stage through emails, there's definitely, depending on what you're using for your giving system, there's definitely ways that you can automate some of that. So as soon as somebody gives, that they're actually being told, thank you for that gift. And when someone gives for the first time, you want to have an opportunity for a pastor or leader to make some kind of direct contact. Doesn't have to be a phone call necessarily. It could be a handwritten letter. It could be an email, just to make sure people know that their gift matters and it's valuable. But Todd, what would you say to that? Are there other ways, and maybe even like outside of the box ways that pastors or church leaders should be thinking about how they can thank their givers?
When your child got the very first gift and that gift was put in their hands, what was the first thing every parent taught their kid to say? Thank you. Thank you. So every single Sunday, 52 Sundays a year, you can tell your people thank you. It might be during a baptism where you could thank a children's volunteer who made a difference. It might be on a rainy Sunday when you had your parking lot greeters getting soaked, but they were out there with smiling faces. Every Sunday, tell them thank you. Every staff meeting, tell your staff thank you. Every leadership meeting you have, tell them thank you. Let them know how everyone's making a difference. Create a culture from the inside out so that the only time we talk about generosity isn't at the end of the year or at a capital campaign or when we're having a tough time in the summer. Every week, every room, every committee meeting, every team meeting, every preschool leader training, start with a story of thanks and generosity and impact. Like, just be thankful. Letters, first time donors, absolutely. Digital givers, absolutely. Once a quarter, do a thank you letter to the entire church and give them a quarterly report on the difference their dollars made. Annually at the time of celebration. There's so many ways. Pick up the phone and call somebody that you saw holding a door for a single mom with 3 kids and tell them thank you. Text somebody, take them to coffee. Be thankful.
Yeah, you really cannot overdo gratitude. Like you cannot go over the top. So you don't ever have to be afraid of that. If there is a way you can show gratitude and say thank you, just do it. Just take that opportunity.
If you're not aware of it, when I make a donation as a layperson to a nonprofit outside of my church, I get a letter, personal letter, thanking me for that exact dollar amount for every single gift I make. They don't just send me an annual statement at the end of the year. I get a thank you letter every month if I give every month. So it's not uncommon in the nonprofit world to be extremely appreciative. And I know it's difficult for pastors because they're concerned someone would know what their gift was. And you can be thankful without knowing what someone's gift is. And you can assure them you don't know in any letter you write, but people need to be thanked.
So I want to jump to another question. So someone's asking so they have a broad vision. Their pastor always says their vision is the Great Commandment and the Great Commission. So it's very broad. So do you have any advice for how to take something that, make it more narrow, or maybe another way to say it, make it more practical for the purpose of driving the budget?
So every church has the same vision. We just say it differently. So that's why I said it's not uncommon to have slogans or taglines, which are fine. They're not necessarily vision. And you can have vision in different ways that becomes measurable. It might be a yearly vision, but you might narrow it all the way down to what's the goal of this sermon series? Like, what's the action step we want them to take? And did they facilitate that? So I think you might have to start with not worry about what the tagline or large vision is, but start, hey, can we just think about what a goal would be to come out of this event? What would be the goal of a sermon? What would be the goal of Fall Festival? What would be the goal of Easter Sunday? And I just go back to the church that says, 10% of their people are giving 80% of their dollars. If that's a situation, you wouldn't normally think, well, let's just set a goal to increase first time donors. Like that's the exact opposite area. But we know if we don't start there, we'll never get them to be even a consistent regular donor. So starting in smaller places that don't feel as challenging to the whole, get some confident wins can help you say, oh, well, that went pretty well. Why don't we do that again? Let's just do it over here now.
That's great. There's a couple of very practical kind of nuts and bolts questions that people are asking. One of them is, what leaders would you suggest to include in the planning process? So if you're having meetings, for example, talking about vision, talking about goals, or creating that calendar for the year, obviously, depending on the type of church, size of church, there's some variations there. But what would be kind of the core people that need to be involved in that process?
Yeah, so this can be so much fun depending on what you're really trying to accomplish. And so you want people who have global knowledge. You want people who can bring some stats to inform everybody. You actually want some creative type thinkers. And they may not be in the hierarchy of your church that you would normally invite them into that meeting, but you need to think more in terms of types of people. You want creative people. You want process oriented people as well. Because if you put a bunch of creatives in a room, you get a lot of ideas, but they just don't tend to go anywhere. We can be overwhelmed, right? So you need some process oriented people. You need some folks that understand the relationship dynamic of change. Because if you're going to move something, you want someone sitting around that says, you know what, when we say this, it's going to sound like this to so and so. So you need someone that's might be intimidated. They were invited to the room, but boy, that one nugget is going to be gold for them. Sometimes I like to invite people who aren't ready for that room because I want to develop staff members for the future. I think it's extremely important that anyone you invite into the room be positive. Positive. Just because they're a banker or a finance person doesn't qualify. Positive, flexible, and spiritually mature, or at least growing. Like positive, flexible, spiritually mature. You can get a lot accomplished with folks like that. So it all just depends on where you are and what you want to accomplish, but don't necessarily think about people who just have the position or the degree.
And one more question, and we'll wrap it up here. So looking at some of the systems that maybe churches have in place, someone was asking if you from churches you've worked with, have any recommendations for any systems to help people stay within their budget in a timely manner. So because a lot of times accounting software is going to lag behind a little bit. If a team, if people have church credit cards and they're spending for their ministry area, and that may not actually be reflected in what's in the budget for a month or more until it actually gets paid. So do you have any systems or anything that you'd recommend for actually staying, up to date on those things and not being caught behind and then overspending for your area?
Right. So worst case scenario is you have this big dreaming session, you increase your budget by 10% in December. In January, everyone starts throwing a big party because they've got all this money. By the time you get to May, it's like, oh my goodness, don't turn the lights on, right? I mean, that's kind of where that thing runs out. It's so important. And my clients who are on this call know this conversation. It is so important that you have a monthly dashboard that everybody has a competency around. Because even though you haven't spent all your budget, that insurance payment went up. We had to fix an air conditioning. We're seeing twice as many people in the kids ministry. I'm sorry, you may not be able to. And you don't want to spring that information on anybody. But also, if you're having monthly dashboards with responsible people for the dollars, and everyone's getting this global conversation of how the money works every single month, you shouldn't have to walk into somebody's office on the last minute and say, hey, like this should be an ongoing conversation we're having all the time that's saying, right, hey guys, let's be mindful. June's coming. Mission trips, VBS, camps. So a monthly dashboard. And then hopefully every month you're sending a detailed report to the most responsible people, and they're double and triple checking, and their direct supervisors having a monthly meeting with them about their ministry activities. And it's more of a normal conversation instead of an isolated conversation when it's pressurous.
Yeah, I think sometimes, especially you can senior leadership may sometimes try to hold some of that financial information close to the vest, and so people that may have authority to spend money within the organization don't actually know what's going on in the organization financially. So being open with that to the people who need to know, that these expenses are going up or giving isn't what we expected this month. So we want to make sure we're strategic in how we're spending money, making sure you're not holding that information too secretively, but you're actually letting your team, the people around you who need to know that, be informed like they need to be.
Yeah, reduces your stress, increases your help. Hey, before we jump off, let me just mention this. If you have not logged into my content channel at SecureGive, I began, I guess, in June or July talking about the big generosity season of the last 6 months of the year. And I try to give a action step of a topic every single month. So go back and pick up some of those. I'm building on all these amazing opportunities. The next one's coming out shortly on how volunteerism increases generosity. And so take a look at those, and I'll put up one every single month.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for that, Todd. And I want to encourage everybody to check out his content. So thank you guys so much. Have a good one.